This is an excerpt from a story called Gloom in the Mortuary of Melancholy, a Lovecraftian tale of loss and regret. Read by Mia. Edited by AKS. Perhaps I should begin by stating my lifelong admiration to the classic Gothic literature. I've had this inexplicable fascination since my childhood due to reasons unclear. Certainly the towering stacks of dusty books in my grandfather's attic attributed to this interest. Yet they fail to explain the innate fascination I've retained since the very beginnings of my subjective timeline. Whatever the case, I never could restrain myself long from getting back into the dark worlds of Poe, Dickens, and their likes. The reason I mention this is because this frenzied interest, coupled with a morbid curiosity to my hometown's past, led me into the haven of this peculiar madman whose tall tales of melancholy were of most extraordinary quality of strangeness. This man, who claimed to have lived for centuries, quite a dubious claim, I admit, inhabited a tomb, or a mortuary more like, of the most unusual kind in a decaying cemetery deep in the woods some kilometers north of town. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I shall first explain how I came to find such a well-hidden hideout. For years I had been practicing relaxing evening strolls around town and its surrounding areas, sometimes out of boredom, but most often in search of certain locations of interest. All kinds of old and forgotten places pique my fascination. Houses, bunkers, and other habitations where man had once dwelled, but later abandoned in search of a better future. Unfortunately, my hometown, excluding its muddied past, is quite an ordinary place. A quiet, middle-sized countryside village with little to nothing when it comes to these kinds of attractions. There are, however, certain hallowed locations and degenerating buildings, the ward and the town cemetery most prominently, which I had numerous times scrounged in search of something mysterious, usually late in the evening, in order to heighten the gloomy atmosphere and allow my imagination that additional boost of mystique. But these late evening strolls proved most often unfruitful. The most I managed to uncover were that of a few homeless wanderers, whose drug-addled speech and unpleasant bodily odors were nothing to write about into my little notebook, the precious thing I always carried with me in hopes of encountering something truly extraordinary. This all changed, however, when, one late evening, I once again decided to visit the town graveyard. It was a typical late autumn evening with the red sun shooting its last rays of light betwixt the pines when I stepped through the open iron gates. The cemetery was nearly empty, only a few slumbering souls wandering amongst the dead, seemingly unwanting to pay visit to anyone in particular, but instead merely stumbling around, reminding themselves of the inevitability. I didn't expect much of this nightly stroll, as I had visited the cemetery numerous times before, and had examined most of the graves in the most excruciating detail. The reason for my visit was the most ordinary one, that of all-engulfing ennui. I needed something mentally invigorating to relight my mind, and the aesthetical decrepitude of the unkempt graveyard acted as good source of sustenance as any. After wandering a while amidst the rows of graves, a certain peculiar man captured my attention. This man, who wasn't clearly young nor old, stood perfectly still in front of one unremarkable gravestone, staring at it without a singular bodily movement. Even the slight gusts of wind, which occasionally raced through the open cemetery, accompanied by a high-pitched sound resembling that of a primitive wind instrument, could not sway this man's perpetual vigil. His stoic watch piqued my interest, and so I made my way towards him, ultimately positioning myself next to him to peer at the gravestone he was looking at. A typical female name was engraved into the stone, the woman's death apparently having occurred a mere few years back. I stood still for a moment beside the man, waiting for him to notice me, but upon understanding his uninterest to spring into action any time soon, I coughed and asked in a low, wary voice, "Greetings, sir. A chilly evening, don't you think?" The man ignored my attempts of communication. I began to doubt he'd hear me at all, but when I was about to continue my inquiries, he surprised me with these sudden words, still staring at the gravestone. "My sister hanged herself 3 years ago." "I'm terribly sorry, sir." I examined the man's face, but saw no change in his strained expression. It felt imprudent to question him on this topic further, so I stayed silent. Soon, however, the man surprised me again by continuing. "She hanged herself after losing her child. She was Well, she hadn't been herself for a long time, and the disappearance... The man stopped to look away, just when I heard tears forming amidst his words. I stood quiet, and he continued, now wiping his eyes. I visited her often, before all that. It was a habit of sorts, you see. But lately I hadn't had time due to my work, and my visits had become... perhaps I should just be plain about it. She was an alcoholic. I had grown tired of her excuses, but had found mine in order to avoid stepping into her appalling dwelling. But still, I shouldn't have abandoned her. I could have done something, if only... He stopped to finally look at me. I had begun to wonder why anyone would express their personal thoughts to a complete stranger like this, but had experienced weirder things in the past. And besides, this solemn autumn evening seemed to have a strange calming quality about it I couldn't quite explain, though I assumed my new friend having sensed this as well. He now said, looking me straight in the eye, pardon me, friend, I didn't quite see you there. I often talk to myself here, you see. Talk to myself as well as her, I suppose. He offered his hand. My name's Charles. What's yours? We shook hands, and thus I got to know the man who eventually revealed the location of the madman's extraordinary haven of gloom and melancholy to me. We chatted for a moment about trivialities that are not important enough to merit a mention here. This went on for some time, and all the while I felt confident about continuing my discussion with the man, not experiencing a hint of boredom, sensing there was something more lurking beneath the waves, something that could lead me to unsolved mysteries or forgotten locations of interest. His way of speaking, which was that of both somber and melancholy, suggested of a life harsh-lived and hinted of past mournful experiences, all the things I knew might polish my dulled mind and make it shine again. I revealed something of myself as well, of course. Discussions rarely go well one way, and I felt this man had, at least in his past, had interests similar to mine. Thus I revealed to him my profession as a painter and an esoteric investigator of sorts, interested in things aforementioned. He listened closely, processing my words with the most intent ear, and when I finished my monologue, said, "That's very interesting. I did similar investigations in my youth, even took part in a certain Gnostic cult a few decades back. Got to know some very fascinating people during that time, but that was a long time ago." He exhaled and looked up into the red late evening sky. "Due to various things, including what happened to my sister, I've got the sense this town has something peculiar about it. A deeper quality, let's say." He turned to face me. Not that I find such things fascinating any longer. What happened to her and her kid was enough for me to move away from here, and nowadays I only visit this godforsaken town in order to pay my respects to her. Our conversation had went on for quite a while, and I felt like we'd get to know each other well enough, so I mustered the courage to ask, "I don't recall you disclosing what happened to the child. Perhaps you could tell me about it, if it's not too much to ask." The man sighed and looked down at the grave. "It remains a mystery, unfortunately. She'd neglected her duties for months by that point, then one day simply left the house for a drunken binge. I don't know where she stayed during that time, nor why she left at all, leaving the kid alone. I visited them a few days prior to these events. I should have intervened. I did call the authorities, but..." He straightened his back and inhaled the cool autumn air. "Whatever the reason, the kid was left alone in the house for days. Later I heard social services had visited the place only to find it empty. Or so they claimed, anyway. In any case, the kid had just ran off into the woods, it seemed, and a thorough search was conducted, unfortunately in vain, as we now know." I asked quietly, and I whispered, "And the mother?" The man gave a somber smile of melancholy. I gripped onto my old navy coat, shielding myself from the wind as it seemed to pick a chilling quality to its hastened pace. "Well, first of all, she was in the hospital at that time, so she only heard of the whole ordeal afterwards. She drank herself into oblivion, and only by mere chance a passerby had rescued her from a ditch near the town's outskirts. How she ended up there no one knows, and asking her about it was pointless, as she remembered nothing of the past week. When she heard about her kid, she was... well, it seemed she finally woke up, in a sense, from her months-long stupor. A harsh wake-up call to reality, one which unfortunately came too late. A sad tale for sure, but I found myself musing more on the mysterious fate of the missing child rather than the reasons for his mother's negligence, as the causes for her alcoholism could have ranged anywhere from genetics and traumatizing upbringing to that of an abusive husband or work-related stress. I well acknowledged the depressing state of our contemporary society. Nowadays, one needn't look afar to find numerous reasons to seek salvation from the bottoms of filthy bottles of the local drunk houses. I focused back on the present as the man continued. If she hadn't been herself before all that, she sure wasn't after it. We did our best, of course, offering her all the help we could after the unfortunate event, but all our attempts fell on deaf ears. Eventually, we resigned our efforts as we had to make room for our own lives and, well, it wasn't long after that she took her life. I felt the urge to ask, what about the ward? Perhaps it seemed like a drastic solution at the time, and I don't want to imply. He interrupted me with a wave of his hand. Yes, that did cross our minds, but I'm sure you've heard of all the mistreatments and other rumors circulating that hideous place. This, and the fact one hardly ever gets to see their loved ones once they've been incarcerated was, and besides, she never wanted our help. We would have had to drag her in there against her will. And that was something beyond what I was willing to do. His words felt reasonable enough to me. I personally knew little about the ward, only of its strict rules of little to no contact for patients with the outside world. In my personal opinion, it all seemed a bit outlandish, although my only investigation had been cut short by a pair of police officers visiting my apartment after the residents had spotted me sneaking about the ward's grounds. Perhaps I should look into it again later, when I have time, but at the moment the facility seems a shadowy and strictly ruled, certainly, but ultimately quite an ordinary place of housing for the mentally afflicted. The evening was growing late, and I still wondered on the fate of the missing child. The man had resumed his everlasting vigil with the headstone, and I sensed he was beginning to feel our mutual time nearing its end. I attempted collecting my thoughts and think of a question that might illuminate our fascinating topics further, without being overly conspicuous, of course. Unfortunately, time flew on, and despite my repeated attempts, I failed to think of anything relevant. I began to get frustrated at my own dull-mindedness. But then, the man surprised me for the third time of the evening by suddenly turning to me asking, "You mentioned being a painter?" I simply nodded, and he continued, motioning at the dead woman's grave. There were certain curious drawings in my sister's house, scribbles made by the kid's hand. We examined them in order to find clues about his whereabouts, but it was hopeless. It matters little now, but perhaps you'd be interested to take a look at them with your artist's eye. If you'd join me tomorrow, in my visit to her abandoned homestead. I was left aghast in face of such a generous offer. I collected myself and answered, "Why, yes, of course, that would be most interesting. Is the house nearby? What happened to it anyway, didn't you?" I still kept fumbling with words, so I coughed and quickly concluded, "Nobody lives there at the moment?" The man smiled for some reason, as if holding some kind of secret about the place, the kind he knew I would find especially interesting. The tombstone shot a reflection from the setting sun as he began. The house was left as is. Perhaps we should have attempted to clean and fix the place up after her death, but it felt wrong, like willfully tarnishing the last remaining memory of her, no matter what kind of memory such a house would leave. He sniffed and added, "Besides, such an attempt could have proved rather difficult, for reasons too lengthy to go into right now." I found nothing else to ask, and thus we concluded our peculiar graveyard conversation. Charles promised to pick me up tomorrow morning, and we would drive to the house, which was located just a few kilometers northeast of town. The place wasn't secluded exactly, he said, but it would still take some time to reach, as the roads were quite bad in that particular section of the woods. He suggested that I take a sturdy pair of jackboots and a battery-full flashlight, just in case, although I was left wondering about the need for additional handheld light, as we would be leaving in the early morn after all. He mentioned nothing more of it, instead waved for a goodbye, and walked with hasted steps out of the cemetery's grounds. Soon he was in his car, driving off, aided by considerable acceleration. I was left standing beside the dead woman's grave, wondering about the event that had just transpired. I looked around, and only now realized it was getting quite dark, the sun having set behind the pines a good while ago, taking the last remaining rays of light along with it. All the people had left as well, I now noticed. I was the only one remaining, unsure what I was still doing there all by myself, a singular living soul amidst the legion of dead. Suddenly the wind picked up speed, and with it carried alien yet strangely familiar tunes of the primordial wind instrument that had harrowed me earlier that day. Something was moving behind the horizon of reason, I sensed. Something enormous, yet it moved not with a loud rumble, but with subtle whispers of persuasion. A nauseating feel began forming in my mind, reminiscent that of a physical illness, as if I was being plagued by gut worms. But these worms were festering not in the stomach, but in thoughts, within the brain, and these things, carrion crawlers of the mind, preyed not on flesh, but on thoughts, and they would feed on fears and ideas of man, consuming the very essence of reason until they'd garnered enough sustenance for. I shook my head, closed eyes, then reopened them, reminding myself I was still alive, standing in front of the dead woman's grave. I looked around, searching for another living being, just to get reaffirmation that I was not alone in this dull twilight zone of a world, not alone with all these febrile ramblings of an incongruent mind. But of course there was no one there to help me. I was completely alone, and I still found myself unable to move. Suddenly a strange force compelled me to look up, and upon doing so I witnessed a murder of crows congregated into a circle, hovering on top of me like a dead dark cloud. I tried to look away, but it was in vain, as it felt like being held prisoner by time itself. I bore witness on this horrid amalgamation for an unknown time until somewhere, far away, a raven cried out, and along with that cry, I finally woke up in my bed.